Well, good morning, everybody. Good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to another edition of CGS Live, VFX episode 27. And yeah, hello out there for everyone that's joining me live. I hope you have had a good weekend or are having a good weekend. Today, I'm going to start working on something different for a change. I'm sure everybody's sick of watching flip videos. So I can't remember who requested it, but somebody wanted to see an explosion. So I'm gonna start tackling that today. Should be a bit of fun. I don't really have a plan. I've been sort of looking at some reference and looking at some backgrounds, maybe some stock footage that we could use. And yeah, we'll just try and build up a shot over however long it takes. Explosions are, easy enough to set up for a basic kind of look, and there are plenty of presets that you can use in Houdini, but, to really dial it in and to really make something that looks quite detailed and quite realistic is, certainly a challenge. So that'll be some interesting things to talk about. So yeah, let's dive in and see what we've got. Hopefully you can hear me. I can see a little pulsing audio signal, so it looks like it's working, but fingers crossed it's working for you too. Alright, so explosions. What are we going to do? So I was looking at, let me bring it up. I don't usually look at reference on the stream, but it's probably a good idea. I was looking at all these, different types of explosions, and nuclear explosions. And to be honest, nuclear explosions to me aren't terribly interesting because they're very just big, big explosions with not a lot going on apart from the main mushroom cloud. So to me, this is not, the most exciting explosion, but I'm going to try and make it more interesting. This one kind of looks quite interesting to me. There's a lot of interesting things going on here, and certainly some nuclear explosions are better than others. Hey, Sniffles, how's it going? I have a bit of a cold today. Hopefully, I don't have the sniffles. That's not real, I don't think. It's hard to tell what's going on there. This is a pretty cool one. Very dense amount of, smoke. And I mean, maybe, yeah. Maybe that's a black and white image that in that other one had been kind of edited. There's so many different types. I guess that's the kind of interesting thing about doing this, doing an explosion or a nuclear explosion. There are so many different ways to go about it. Spiky explosions. Mohammed, hey gang. Hey Jono. Love explosions. Yeah, don't we all? Yeah, this one's quite interesting. I think, spiky explosions are very so hot right now, I guess. I would say, they're very kind of popular in a lot of films, and there are a lot of ways of doing that easily in Houdini now. So you do tend to see a lot of those kind of spiky explosions, which we've seen in Avengers and Iron Man, and it's the real kind of classic VFX explosion that everyone's doing right now. So I'm going to try and stay away from that style of explosion. We may have elements of it, but we can talk about all these different kind of techniques and different ways. I think that one that I brought up, I don't know how I got to it. Let's see. Maybe through here. That's kind of an interesting thing, but yeah, that's kind of what I don't want to do. So, there we go. An organic explosion. What do you mean by that, Jono? What does that mean to you, organic? Because it means different things to different people. That's cool. Lots of little details in something like that, with lots of little trails. And so we're kind of getting off course here a little bit. Let's have a look what else. I quite like these black and white images of the sort of the tests, I guess. These were the original sort of nuclear tests that they did in the French atolls, I guess. Krakatoa eruption type of explosion. That's a cool idea, Rizwan. How you going? I probably won't do a volcano at the moment, but let's have a look here. I'll add it. I think I may already have it on my list. Let me add it. I've got nuclear explosion. Let me do volcano, because that's a good idea. Oh, okay. Like a real life looking explosion, not a super good looking CG explosion. Good idea. Yeah, I would definitely like to create something that looks realistic. Which is why, you know, it's good to start with looking at some reference, just so that we can sort of, you know, see what sort of details we're aiming for. And yeah, even though these photos are black and white, they still show a lot of really interesting detail. Lots of really cool stuff happening on the ground, which supports the main kind of cloud. So let's change this to say photo, and then hopefully that will get rid of all the CG ones, although it doesn't look like it has. This image is really cool. I really like this. This is apparently the first ever nuclear explosion. And that's really, really cool. I don't know what's going on there exactly, but it looks awesome. Reminds me of Akira or something. Let's have a look. What else? And I apologize if you know, looking at these makes people sad, as I'm sure it might for some people. You know, I'm as an effects artist, I'm quite desensitized to this stuff, but you know, I know that these kind of events are sort of steeped in, you know, a lot of horrible history. So I apologize. That's crazy. Look at that. Amazing. So, you know, all these details are things that I'm looking at, like all these lines. I think they have a particular name. I can't remember what it is now, but these sort of straight lines that get shot up when the explosion goes off, and then they just kind of get vectored and carried along. Hey, David. Yeah, that's right. It's boom time. You know, things like this are really cool as well. Seeing that kind of, that sort of just weird cloud that appears and then just gets pushed out, and you know, this kind of stuff. I mean, this one's on water, which I promise I'll stay away from the water, but you know, this crazy perfectly circular shockwave is amazing. It's incredible. Oh, there's more of that original nuclear blast. Looks like something from some 70s sci-fi something. All right, enough jibber jabber. Let's start building something, and we'll see what we kind of get to. But it's clear to me, Krakatoa blew itself to bits in 1883. Yes, correct. It would be cool to do something like that, Rizwan. Definitely, I'll definitely come back to that. Yeah, I think this kind of scenario, like a desert type explosion with a lot of ground-based effects, is going to be cool. So let's look at doing something like this. You can see, like, here's another one with mountains in the background, and again we have that circular shockwave, so we can still do that. We can do it on the ground, but all this kind of stuff is really cool. All this cloudy type stuff. So there's a lot of things going on here. There's a main explosion, then you got these shockwaves and these clouds, and then if we can combine that with also having the lines in there, this looks like it might have been painted, this image, but as in hand colored. If we can get those kind of lines, these lines here as well, I think that would be really cool too. So let's start taking a look. Usually when I start an explosion, I might just start with something like a sphere, But let's build a little bit of an environment to start with. So I'm going to just create a grid that's 100 by 100. So that's 100 meters, wide and deep. And then I'm going to, let me just call that ground. And then I'm going to just do a bit of timing stuff here where, and actually what I'll do, I'll also put in just a little bit of scale reference. I'll just put down a Tommy, test geometry Tommy, so that, I don't lose track of how big this thing is getting. So he's, sort of regular human scale, sort of 1.5, I think, or 1.7 maybe. I guess we could tell by middle clicking on him. 1.78. So, regular human size. So we've got him there as a reference, so reference scale. Because, when you're looking at spheres and grids and you sort of lose sight of the scale on the construction plane, then it kind of, it's easy to make things too big or too small. But if you have something like that for reference, then it's always good to refer back to that. So my sphere is going to just be my guide for, how large this explosion is going to get. So I reckon probably, we don't want it to be as large as 100 meters across. That's probably a little bit too large. So, maybe something like that. Here's our Tommy down here. He's really, really small. So maybe our explosion kind of gets to about that big and then carries up. So let's use that as a guide. 25, 30, yeah, let's say 30 is the max. So what I could do now is just sort of dial in a little bit of a look for this explosion in terms of the speed. And it's really useful to do this sort of stuff. It's very tempting to get straight into simulations and setting all that up, but really you want to kind of work this out so that you've kind of, in a very simple way, you've just worked out what the timing of this thing is and what the scale is, and then you have a guide when you're setting up simulations, which are much harder to kind of set up and control. And this, becomes a really good reference point. So what I did there was just made it expand quite a bit quicker in the first 9 frames, and then, well, actually just to its maximum, but what I could do is just wind that down a little bit so it expands rapidly, and then just continues to expand, but much more slowly for that last sort of, whatever that is, 15 frames. Maybe I'll make that 10. So there we go, we get very quick, let me turn that on, very quick expansion, maybe even a bit too slow for an explosion. Usually that expansion is really rapid. But we can adjust that, we can pull it down so we can have it over 5 frames and then it just slowly kind of evolves like that. Alright, so let's have a look. Let's create a little camera here, something like this. And then I'm just going to do a quick little flipbook, just so I can see what this plays back at properly. Okay, play. There we go. So, you can see you get that rapid expansion and then a slowdown. And you can imagine what's happening now is that, we've had that expansion and then it's just continuing to rise. And that's the thing with mushroom clouds, is that you get that big expansion at the start and then it's that big mass that just continues to rise upwards. And the emission is kind of stopped. It expands and then stops, and then you get this big ball that rises upwards, but then underneath is a long kind of thin stalk, which creates that mushroom look because the emission has sort of stopped or shrunk back down. So, alright. Let's just call this guide sphere. Now, it's not always, necessary to do this, but I find that it does kind of help in just quickly figuring out, what is going on there. So let's jump in to a new container. We'll call this one explosion. And I'm going to create a sphere. And I'm just gonna create it about, let's go 5. And then now I'm gonna just jump into creating a volume and trying to set this up as quickly as possible, and then I can go back and tweak. So just going to create some attributes on a points from volume from that sphere, and I'm just going to say at density equals 1, at fuel equals 1, at temperature equals 1. Yeah, that's kind of alright. I mean, you know, it kind of depends which way you want to set this up, but I am still in the old pyro method of creating fuel and temperature to create my explosions, but you could potentially, you know, do the other way. If you have a look at what the pyro source creates, it creates when you want to do fuel. Oh, you can do the fuel and temperature method, but you can also do the burn method. And burn gets converted into flame in the Sparse solver. We could do this sparse actually, but let's just see. I'm going to do an attribute volume rasterize attributes and turn those into volumes. And density fuel. And this is quite big, this volume already, so when I do that, it's creating relatively large volume, 1 million, so I might just take my voxel size down a little bit, just for testing. There we go, 10,000 temperature. And then, what am I going to do? I could try just running this into a pyro solver, just a SOP-based one, which actually, you know, I find pretty good for a lot of things, but it is set up to run sparse by default, so it's enabled sparse sort. You can turn it off, but the default kind of stuff is all set up to work this way. You can see here burn being turned into flame. Now, I didn't create a burn volume, I created a fuel volume, but I could just do this, fuel to flame instead. Or I could just have a single volume for temperature and turn temperature into flame. It doesn't really matter. I don't have velocity, but let's just see. You can see as soon as I did that, it created the fire look. So let's just hit play. I might just take my voxel size down. And you can see our sphere there as a guide. So, you know, we know that we're kind of off the mark in terms of scale. But we do have, you know, something happening. And pyro, by its very nature, will create a mushroom type cloud. Usually we want to get rid of mushroom shapes, but in this instance, you know, it's what we want, so it's going to be kind of good. Now, we're not expanding our source much at the moment. What we could do is on the pyro solver, come over to the simulation tab, flames tab, go to expansion, add expansion, and just set it to quite a large value. And you can see now we're getting much larger expansion happening, and you can see the sort of voxels and the sparse grid stuff happening. So we need to kind of play with that, but we got like massive expansion, and it's hitting the size of our sphere, which is cool. So that's good, but you know, it's just going to continue to expand as well. So you may want to turn that down. Hey Max, how's it going? So you may want to turn the expansion rate down or animate it. So the easiest way to do this kind of animation rather than setting keyframes is to do a fit. So I'm just going to do a fit and then fit $F between the range that you want to ramp this value. So let's say between 1 and I'm going to say 1 and 15. I'm going to go from 10 to 0 like that. And so if I just disable the sim for a second and scrub through, you can see that it's going to come down to 0. Hey Keegan MM, thank you for the comment. I'm glad you could join me. Yeah, it's probably quite late for you over there, right? Midnight or something, or maybe even later. But thanks for joining me. Glad you're enjoying them. All right, so I've got this fit $F between 1 and 15. So at frame 1 it's at value 10, and at frame 15 it's at 0. So it just will interpolate between... You can even change this to $FF just to make sure that it works on subframes as well. And now what we should see, it's probably not going to hit the right size anymore, but what we will see is a reduction in expansion over time. So we will get, right at the start, we'll get this large expansion, and then it will shrink back down in terms of the expansion. And hopefully what we'll see is a really large mushroom cloud now, because we've got that big expansion at the start and then a contraction, so that what we end up with is like a little stalk underneath once this rises. Hopefully it does. You can start to see it now. It's starting to turn. Let's see what happens. It's pretty slow. I may need to turn my settings down a little bit. Let's see what res we're dealing with. 34 million. Oh yeah, it's pretty high. Let's go 0.5. It's gonna be pretty low res, but I just want to see this quickly. Oh, there we go. It's a bit faster. Very blocky, but we can kind of hopefully see a little more what's going to happen. The blocks are kind of doing some weird things for our scale, but... And we don't have a ground plane either, which is probably, you know, something that we should do. But here is our little... Here's our stalk from our mushroom. So there you go. So you get that big expansion, and it looks bad at the moment, but that's what we're sort of trying to get, that big expansion, and then that little stalk at the end. It probably shouldn't be fire, it would probably just be density at that point, but, you know, that's alright. So to turn that off, to stop that from emitting fire, we should just turn off the fuel, or the flame as well. So yeah, just set that as well. We could copy that same thing here, fit$F, put that on sources, and let's go from 1 to 0 over that same, or maybe, you know, just between 10 and 15, ramp from 1 to 0. So that for the first 10 frames, that's on at 1, and then over 5 frames, it reduces down. Now, at the moment, you know, I'm fully aware that it looks like crap, but that's kind of okay. I'm just trying to work out the like base motion and base settings. And to be honest, I don't know if I'll stick with the Sparse solver at this point. I may just go and create my own custom one, so that, you know, I have much greater control over it. And I really prefer, you know, not using the Sparse solver. I find that sometimes I can't get great results with it. But yeah, so there you go. Now I'm just left with density. I'm not getting my fire turned into density, so, you know, to do that you would probably want to come to smoke and turn on emit smoke, so that the flames will also generate smoke. Let's have a look at that. There we go. So now we should be left with some smoke. When the flames disappear, they should leave behind some smoke, hopefully. We may not be visualizing it correctly. Yeah, it doesn't really look like they're leaving anything behind. Let's go to the look tab and crank up the density. Oh, there we go. It is there. It's just super light. So there you go. We end up with that kind of thing. But oh, you know what? The default behavior of this is to dissipate smoke incredibly quickly. So take that right down. We don't really want the smoke to dissipate. 0.5 would be 50% of the smoke removed every frame, which is mental. You know, it's like a steam simulation. Steam disappears. Smoke doesn't really disappear. It just sort of dissipates. And usually over a much longer duration. Steam would condense back into water, so it disappears or condenses and becomes invisible again. But yeah, smoke doesn't really do that, so you don't really want high dissipation with smoke. Now we can see we've got a ton of smoke happening, so it's probably too much, but at least we've got that behavior back. And also I cranked it up on the look tab so we could come back here and turn that down again. Just pause that for a second. Okay, so there we go. Very, very dense. But, that's okay. We don't have a light in here. Having a light in the scene will help have a look at that, because it looks very flat. So I'm just going to control click a spotlight in there. And then we can see what we're dealing with. And, the low voxel count, as well as the sparse solver, is, causing this to look quite odd. But, that's okay. We're getting somewhere. Now, if I just let this play, what we'll get, from having such a large volume created and then, it shrinking down, you get this nice feeling of advection happening, this kind of suction that occurs underneath the main cloud, because this is sort of creating this rolling velocity, and you get this nice feeling of the bits underneath getting sucked up by that. So that's really cool. Now let's add a ground. So go to setup, treat y as closed below 0. That means that y below 0 will be treated as a kind of ground plane. It's not exactly the same as a ground plane, but it sort of does serve as a solid kind of collision rather than it traveling through the bounds and just getting deleted. It will kind of stick to the bounds. But what I've found is that a physical ground plane actually does work better, like a proper collider. It has a bit more stickiness because it has a velocity. Then when you create a collision, it creates a collision velocity, whereas the closed doesn't really seem to do that. And it seems to create this nice feeling of stickiness to the ground, so that these things you can see, they didn't really stick to the ground, they just kind of came off. You can see a bit of stickiness happening down here, but I think with the ground plane that just gets a lot greater. You can see by doing that closed below, that has made a dramatic difference to the look, which is really cool. This underside is looking a lot better now. So definitely is important to have that on. And now you can see that advection a lot greater as well, which is cool, that suction that's occurring. So, already, whoops, whoa, I didn't need to do that. Accidentally hit the radial menu. So already, it's low res, it's not looking super amazing, but it's getting there. It's got some of those, those physical parameters. Now it's very symmetrical, which is interesting. Probably part of the low res, but also probably because we're just using a perfectly symmetrical source. But there's some cool things going on there. So at this point, I'm going to abandon this pyrosolver in favor of doing it from scratch, because I want this to be good and I want to have ultimate control. So I'm just going to leave this one over to the side and set this up again using just the regular pyrosolver. I'm not going to go sparse. Would you ever scale this down to work with it faster? Well, it's funny, Brennan. It's kind of relative, like pyro actually doesn't, it's not necessarily going to solve faster at a smaller resolution or a smaller scale, because I still need to get the resolution into the same kind of ballpark. Like, I don't think of it in terms of what am I looking for? Smoke object. I don't think of it in terms of division size, because division size is relative. When my scale is much larger, my division size will be larger. When my scale is smaller, my division size will be much smaller. It might be 0.005, whereas at this scale, my division size might be 0.5 instead, or 0.5, or even 1 or something, depending on the scale. So yeah, I don't think it's necessarily going to go faster at a smaller scale. Scaling with Pyro is kind of more about like what sort of details you want to get out of the simulation without, you know, doing too much to it or adding too many shaping settings. At a larger scale, I'm going to get much more finer, sort of smaller swirls out of it. At a small scale, like that, just by default, I'll get that sort of stuff happening at a larger scale, and it will sort of match the scale that I'm going for. You know, this is meant to be a giant explosion, so I want to kind of push. Thanks for sharing, Rizwan. I want to kind of push, you know, that scale element. Whereas if I did it at a small scale, I might struggle to get the same feeling. The scale of the simulation will look a bit different, and I'll have to really fiddle with the values. Whereas if you go for the scale that you're, you know, the true scale, then it's easier to get the feeling. Like, I don't always do it like this. Sometimes I will work at a smaller scale, but I do find with explosions they do work better at a larger scale. You just get more of that sense of scale and that slow kind of speed, which you want. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's like there's always multiple ways of doing things in Houdini, and sometimes it's just kind of how I feel on the day, whether I'm going to do it that way. But yeah, you know, I have found that sometimes when I'm struggling with an explosion and I just can't get it to look right, it may be because my scale is wrong. Like I've gone too small and I need to make it bigger. RBDs are a different story, although you still have the same kind of considerations for the movement, but RBDs are something that I will always work at 10 times scale, just because it does get rid of a lot of problems. But yeah, Pyro is kind of one of those things that you can scale up and down. But speed should be relative, because the division size will be larger at larger scales. Anyway, alrighty. So let's have a look at some good ways of setting this up. Smoke object. By default, you can just, you know, kind of set a bounding box on here. But that's not very... Are there multiple ways of doing things in any software? Yes, but not always. I mean, Houdini is incredibly flexible. So, you know, the way one person does it, someone might have a completely different way of doing it. But some softwares, you know, you have to do it a specific way, otherwise it doesn't work. So I think Houdini is a bit more flexible than many other softwares. So what I'm going to do here is create a bounding box. And this is going to be my maximum bound. So I'm going to just set this size to be 100 by 100. Let's see, 100 by 100. That was what my original grid scale was. So look at that. There we go. 100 by 100. And I'm going to go like 200 high. So maybe too much. Let's have a look through the camera. Whoa, look at that. I guess I'm really close to this thing in the camera. Let's try that. 100 by 100 by 100. Just for starters. I'm going to create a null here and call this out max bounds. So I'm doing this the old way, but this is the way that, you know, I'm used to working, and it's also the way that I've found I can get, you know, the best kind of results. But, you know, Sparse, it's all the same. You know, just whatever floats your boat. And we can look at doing it again in Sparse. So in here, I'm actually not going to put the max size in this size here. This is more the initial size. So I'm going to make another bounding box, which is just tight to the sphere. So I'll put a bound object down and put it around in my source here. And I'm going to call this out initial bounds. And this setup, you know, works for anything, any sort of pyro that you might want to do. Now I'm going to use a bbox function to point to that. So bbox and then the path, dot dot slash initial bounds. And then let me just close that. And then you can see down here it tells you, you know, the different things that you can put in. But I'm going to do size, so d_x size. Oops. There we go. And you can see I got I got something happening. Let's try dy size. Oh, this is the initial. That's right. So that looks right. And then z size. So you need, each one needs to be the correct one for its axes. And then the center is the center's kind of fine, but ideally what you would do is a centroid expression, which is very similar, but it's centroid and then the path again, initial bounds, and then it's a d underscore x for that part. And, oh, I didn't close that off. There we go. And then d underscore y, d underscore z. Oh, I'm pasting that one with errors, yuck. All right, there we go. So now I need a gas resize fluid dynamic, and this is going to be where I'm going to put that max bounds. Here it is. By default, it's clamping to this bounds, but you can change it to from object or initialization dynamic. Something like that, and then pick, or actually we can just type the path, dot dot slash out max bounds. And then when I hit play, it's going to resize to this max boundaries based on this field. So it's going to look at the density field, and as the density field expands, it's going to resize. There's a padding as well, and some scales that you can apply. We'll have a look at those in a sec. Now, let's have a look at our volume source. We're going to add in, let's just double check what we have. We've got fuel, temperature, density. So let's add those in. Fuel is a scalar field, only has one component. So fuel into fuel. Temperature into temperature. And fuel into fuel, temperature into temperature, and density into density. All right, we have combustion turned on by default, so that's going to work. We've got, everything kind of set up. Let's turn on our multi-field visualizer. Density field, density. Emission field, I'm going to put temperature. You also, with this this method of pyro, you also get heat, but for explosions, temperature is probably better. It's a bit more diffused. Okay, let's turn on our emission scale, hit play. Let's see what we get. We get an error. Oh, you know why? Because we didn't give this a path. First context. Meters, Rizwan, is the default for Houdini. So you can see we're getting our sourcing, but the expansion is a bit weird. On the gas resize fluid dynamic, the reference field is density, but we should include temperature in that, because that temperature is our main kind of field, and also our padding is really, really small based on our scale. So let's give it a padding of like 3. See how that works. Oh, there we go. Now I might not have this correct. I think maybe I need to do from object. Let's try that. There we go. That looks better. Okay, so we got something happening, but we don't have the stuff that we set up on this guy. So we need to look at how we can do that. Now, pyro solver, combustion, gas released, 15 by default. So we could go and increase that, or we could do the same thing. Let's just copy that expression that we had, just because I'm lazy. I don't want to type it out again. I'm going to copy it from here, and I'm going to put it here. But 15 in, gas release of 15 or 10 in here is maybe a little low. So I'm going to put it to 100. And then we should see rapid expansion. I might actually also turn down my division size to 0.25. There we go. And look, it's nice and quick as well, which is good. So, yeah, I don't know why the other one was a little bit slower, but this one seems to be doing okay. There we go. So we got a similar kind of thing happening now. And again, you got to watch the default dissipation. I think it's 0.1 with this one. Let's have a look at that. 0.1, yeah. So that's probably still a little bit too high, but it's better than 0.5. All right, there we go. So we got our mushroom cloud effect happening. So we've got our rapid expansion, which I think probably is a little bit too slow. So one thing we can also do here with the simulation is animate the timescale up and down. So we could, let's set the timescale at 2 and see if that makes the expansion go a little faster. That's a little bit better. So what you can do is set a keyframe for that. So ramp it up really quickly, and then maybe over, until frame 24, we can actually come down below, because if you look at reference of explosions, they're usually, when they're large, they're usually quite slow. So they have a massive rapid expansion and then a very slow rise and continuation. Because of the scale, they're covering actually a large distance, but it looks slow from far away. So that's a good way to get that feeling, to get that rapid expansion and then slow down. All right, cool. Not bad, but still a little bit slow to me. So what I'm going to do here is, with my sphere, I'm actually going to animate it. So I'm going to set a keyframe on the uniform scale here. I'm actually going to rise this up a little bit so it's above the ground plane. Just a little bit. Because it's cutting off the bottom of the sphere when it comes into pyro. So, like that. And let's go to frame 5 and increase it to 15. So that we get this. Large expansion. Maybe even more. I don't know. Let's try that. So what's going to happen with this is that we're going to get this kind of thing happening. Let's check out our res. Yeah, it's not too bad. Okay. Now our resize might not be able to cope with this. So let's try upping the padding. Let's go 10. That's better. We might want to also make our initial bounds a little bigger. So on the bound node, you can actually just increase scale of that. So we may just want to just pad that out a little bit, and then the initial bounds will be larger. Let's have a look at that. So you can see by animating the source out, it will fill that space with fuel. And then we get a nice big round shape as well. And we can look at adding details to the surface of the shape to the source after. But now we're getting like this nice big expansion over, that's just 6 frames there. We might need to turn down our expansion now to cope with that. But I think that's looking not too bad. I'm going to create a DOP import here. I just want to see DOP import fields. I want to see what resolution I've got in my sim. So merge out the smoke object. Set the presets to pyro is fine. Don't have a bunch of these fields, but if I middle click here, you can see 8 million. So really, it's not bad at all. So let's hit play. Keep going. Hey, thanks, Alexander. Thank you for that. It means a lot. And I will keep going. I'm glad you're enjoying the classes or sessions. So you can see I'm putting a lot of work into this initial setup. I'm not worrying about the shape, the look at the moment. For me, it's all about how does this thing move? Is the expansion looking right? Before I even get into the actual look of it, it's more about the motion and the feeling of it before I worry about that other stuff. I think it's very easy add in the disturbances and all that kind of stuff. Although getting them looking right is a challenge, but it's very easy to just turn all that stuff on, and then you're dealing with like so many variables that it becomes quite challenging to kind of manage everything. I'm just going to turn off my gas release for a second. Set it back to 10, just so I can see what I have without that. So that, I mean, that's the main challenge with Pyro, is there are so many things, there are so many options and so many variables that it becomes quite hard to figure out, you know, how to make a change when you've got so many things going on. So by leaving as many things off as possible, it allows me to just really focus on the main performance, and then the shaping and everything is just extra. I've got the main performance down, that's working, and then everything else is just details. So yeah, the way I look at it. So we've got a nice anime explosion at the moment. Perfect sphere. Our padding is very high as well, so you know that's possibly a reason why it's running a bit slow. I don't know why it's kind of running quite so slow. I guess it's just the large volume that's creating. The thing with, you know, the non-sparse method of Pyro is it is, you know, slightly inefficient in that you've got this big bounds here that is full of data. And that's the thing with Pyro, is that with Sparse is that it, you know, it tries to limit the data to just where the volumes are. And that's why they're more efficient. You can see here I've got quite a large amount of padding, so it's reasonably inefficient. Let me just turn my division size up to 0.5. Also, you know, you can just check, make sure you're not using any substeps. It looks like the volume rasterizes the slow part as well, so, you know, come out here and just double check that. You can see that that is actually taking a little while to cook, and perhaps even the points from volume, you know, is generating a ton of points. That's probably a big part of it. Let's take that up to 0.5 is probably enough. Maybe that's what it was. Ha! There we go. Alright, points from volume. Anything volume related, you'd have to keep an eye on, especially when you're working at large scales, because you can make a mistake and it ends up creating some ridiculous scale of volume that will just kill you. Alright, so we've got our rapid expansion happening. That's cool. But let's now look at... I'm just going to do this in the activation of my source. I'm just going to say $F less than, I don't know, 15. That means that it's going to evaluate to 1 when it's less than 15. And then when it flicks over to 15 and greater, it's going to be 0. So the source will just turn off. Keegan, I'm using OpenCL with Pyro typically... is using OpenCL with Pyro typically avoided? Is it down to video card? No, it's not typically avoided. I mean, yeah, it is down to video card. I don't have the greatest video card in the world, so I find that it's actually faster for me to run on CPU rather than GPU. Not all aspects of Pyro are kind of on the GPU, so it's like I find with a lot of the OpenCL stuff in Houdini, it's kind of a hybrid anyway, so it does use a portion of the CPU as well as the GPU. We can turn on OpenCL, but I don't know what it is, but I find that it doesn't always create a benefit for me. So yeah, I mean, possibly it is just down to the video card that I have, meaning that it's just no better. But there we go. Now we've got our mushroom, and our source has been turned off, so it will just continue to lift. One thing that is really cool with the GPU, and I'm sure I've mentioned this in the past, is that you've got this GPU explosion setup, which uses the minimal solver with Pyro. And what you'll see is that it's this looping explosion. This is real time, so this is running on the GPU, and you can, you know, increase the voxel size and just play with the settings to see what. Oh, there we go. Take it down a bit. Play with the settings to just see what kind of happens when you change stuff in here. So, you know, what happens when I set disturbance really high or dissipation really high. And that's really cool. And so I might come back to utilizing something like that as well. But I want to kind of experiment with a few different options and just see, you know, what I kind of get. So now I'm getting like mega expansion, big ball, and then my source turns off, which is cool. Let me even go 1 on this, because I don't actually need it to be that that high for testing. So there we go, big explosion. Maybe we should pull our camera back. And I'm probably going larger than I should ghost my sphere, because I'm probably stepping over my, you know, my original sphere size, which I don't really want to do. So let me just come in here. So yeah, I am much larger. So that's why it's good to have it there, just so you don't lose sight of that. So let's do this. I'm going to scale this back down as well. So I'm going to go big, and then I'm going to scale it down to maybe 3. And perhaps I can just turn down my expansion as well, 5. All right, let's play that. Turn this off. And I'm going to take that. I don't have it. Let me recreate it. Where's my fuel? Here. So I'm going to say fit $F between, let's say 10 and 15. And I'll go 1 to 0. So that's going to turn my fuel off now, but keep my temperature and my density pumping in. There we go. Hey, there we go. So I could turn off my temperature as well. Let's do the same thing. And then I'll probably just get density left behind. There we go. Mushroomy. Great. So there's our perfect mushroom. Incidentally, this is a really good way of modeling mushrooms. If you took that and did a, let's see, convert VDB. Fog to SDF. Let's just do density. Convert to polygons. I got a mushroom. Look at that. And so, you know, if this had a bit more detail to it or something, you could do some really interesting kind of things with it. Especially if it had noise or, you know, yeah, you can mesh, you know, any sort of volume. So it can be a really interesting way of creating things. And obviously this is super small, but, or super low res, I mean, but yeah. It's a fun kind of way of creating mushrooms. Anyway, I digress. All right, so we got that. I kind of like this. This is looking quite cool. What's going on there? Let's put a ground plane in. And see what that does. What we should see is that sticky feeling to the ground. And I might actually also 0.5 my dissipation, so it's just gives me a little bit less. Hey, I can't pronounce your name, but hi. Thanks for joining me. Here's some interesting things that are happening here too, these little trails. Let's go to the smoke object and look at our density scale. just so we can sort of play with those values that we have there. Maybe jump out as well so that we can see what that looks like with the light on. Hide other. Yeah, so some quite interesting things going on there. Let's put a volume visualization down. And go to density, crank up the density scale. Just to have a look at what we've got. I mean, this is still super low res, but you know, you can see that there are some interesting details starting to occur. So that gives me confidence that, you know, I'm on the right track. And then everything I add is just going to be a sweetener. You know, it's going to be that nice little detail that I need. My behavior is the thing that's working, and that's kind of cool. So let's have a, while that's simulating, let's have a quick look at details and things that, you know, we might want to get. That one's really cool. Lots of fine details, lots of billowy clouds. These kind of straight lines in the center are interesting, these sort of linear shapes that I'm seeing. We've also got this kind of double mushroom cloud happening on this one, which is cool too. Now I'm just going to turn on closed boundaries as well for Y, just so that there is a negative, because possibly this ground plane is not colliding. Let's just turn on the collision and see. Yeah. I think that collision is not... Oh, there you go. You can see it right at the start, but then it sort of gets clipped out. And I think the reason is that my max bounds here are right on 0. If you have a look at that, they're right on 0. And the ground plane lies there as well. So what I should do is just drop this down slightly. Let's go 49, so it's like 1 meter below 0. And then what we should see, hopefully, is our ground plane collision coming through. There you go. So you want that coming through, and we can probably turn off closed boundaries now. You want that coming through because that is what will create that stickiness to the ground, that kind of 0 velocity, that area of no velocity, which will slow down the smoke in that area where it touches it. Hopefully, although it's sort of not doing an amazing job of it. Let's try this. I'm going to try creating a box instead of the ground plane, and I'm going to make it 100 by 100, and I'm going to drop it to be negative 0.5. Then the top surface of that will be on 0, and I'm going to output that. So I'm actually going to give it a whole bunch of subdivisions. Polygon mesh, something like that. Then I'm going to give it normals. So facet, precompute normals. And I'm going to also give it a velocity attribute, which is 0, 0, 0. Out, ground, geo. And then I'm going to do a VDB from polygons on that. And call that out. So this is just your standard way of creating a collision for pyro, whether it's the ground or anything. And I want to try, so I'm pretty sure it does make a difference. I want to try bring that ground in. Instead of using a ground plane, I'm going to bring that in like this. Sop path. Background geo, it's not deforming, don't have object transforms, collisions, volume sample, proxy volume, background VDB. We can check that. That looks good. But the main thing to worry about is this. So let's see that we have collisions. Yes, we do have collisions. Let's see if it influences the way that that sticks to the ground. It may not make too much difference at this stage. Yeah, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference. Let's see if there's any density there. Maybe it's just too thin, that stuff. I don't know. No, maybe not. 500. You can see there is actually density there, but it's super kind of low density stuff. All that stuff. It's just a bit too low. So, let's, I mean, that's crazy. We shouldn't have our density at 5,000. Let's go to our combustion smoke tab, and it does have emit smoke turned on. I'm going to turn on create dense smoke, and yeah, I'll leave these settings. There's actually a good indication in the help of how these work, these heat cutoff and blend amount settings. If you just do find smoke and then maybe jump to it. Here we go. Yeah, this. So this is the heat cutoff and blend amount. So the heat here is sort of talking about when the smoke is going to get created. So 0.2 is the default, which is here. You can see it's sort of as the heat field is cooling down, it's going to create the smoke in this part. So it's trying to create that effect of a flame licking up and then turning into smoke. But if you set it to 1, it will just emit smoke from everywhere. And then you have this blend amount where it's going to blend that value through all of the different areas. You can actually set it to burn, which is just the point where fuel is turned into heat. Or you could potentially jump inside and try and modify it to work with temperature. But let's use heat, and we'll just set it to 1. Or you could even set the blend amount to 1, so it just blends over everything. And also increase the smoke amount if you wanted something to be really, really dense. Turning on create dense smoke will just keep emitting smoke in when that heat field is present. So that just will add more and more smoke, no matter what the kind of smoke value is. Without that, there's a limit, and it won't keep adding it. But you could potentially just, keep cranking that up. Let's see what that looks like at 100. Jump out here. Yeah, it's weird not getting that sticky feeling. Another thing you can do, which is quite interesting, is on the static objects you can actually have temperature. So you can impart some temperature to the object. If you do -100, let's see if it does it. Aha! That worked. So see that? It's created this negative temperature in this area, which is causing that area to fall, essentially, or cool. Like, you could have a look at the temperature field to see what that's actually doing. So that can be an interesting thing to try as well. If you have a look at the temperature slice here, you can see that the temperature gets removed from this area that's near the plane, near the ground. That's quite cool. Now, it may affect our shading, because we're actually removing temperature in that area. Maybe we don't need to do 100. Maybe that's too high. But you can see what sort of effect it has for stuff that's on the ground. It looks quite interesting. You get that kind of shockwave effect. That's what I was going for, that kind of sticky feeling to the ground. Now, of course, I could do that with a separate source as well. That would be something that you could potentially do. But that's quite a cool thing you can try, adding temperature. And like I said, it doesn't necessarily need to be 100. You could try just -10 or -1. See what that does. Even -10 might just cause some of that area to hang a little bit lower than the others. And that in turn might create, some interesting details. Like you can see, some interesting stuff going on there. I don't know if you can animate this. Maybe. You could always bring it in as a separate source as well if you wanted to really control it. Alright, so, you know, giant ball of fire aside, I'm relatively happy with the things that are going on in this. And so yeah, you can see some interesting stuff happening there. The negative temperature may be creating some weird effects, but I don't know, it's kind of okay. Now, let's have a look at our source. So our source at the moment is just a ball. There's nothing much going on there. So I'm going to turn this to a polygon, give it a bit of frequency, and then I'm going to run it through a point VOP. I'm going to add a turbulent noise to it. So I'm going to add that to P, like that. Make 3D noise. Let's crank the amplitude and make it original Perlin. There we go, it's a bit better. Alright, so something cool you can do here is add a facet to create normals, pre-compute, and then I'm going to multiply my normals. So you can see if I add normals to P, I get essentially a peak. So it's going to push that object out. So our normals look like this. So it's going to push the object out in that area. And normals get when you create a normal, it's usually a value between 0 and 1 in any particular axis. So it's adding that value of 1 in that direction. But if I multiply that normal value by noise, I get noise in the area of, like, in the direction of the normals instead. So that can actually be a one-dimensional noise. And now you can see I can get noise just in the direction of the normals, not just kind of crazy and everywhere looking like crumpled paper. And then I can also add a multiplier on top of that out here, which could be an overall multiplier. So here I can create, some interesting spiky shapes. And that's just going to serve to roughen up the surface of my my object. I'm also going to add jitter to my point from volume. So I've got a jitter scale here. I can put $F in here, and that will then jitter every frame. And you can see what's happening now. As that sphere scales up, it's actually just pushing through that noise, and that noise is changing every frame because the object is moving, the P position is changing, so the noise that's referencing that P is changing. And then also our jitter is going to be changing in here. So you can see those points changing every frame as well, even though the object isn't moving at the end here. You can see those points are changing. So all of that is going to add variation to our source. So let's jump in and see how that changed it. There we go. Eventually, ultimately, it's becoming quite spherical because of the expansion that we've got on there. But also, what we have in Pyro by default is temperature diffusion. So that's going to be blurring the temperature field. If you have a look at how the temperature field first comes out, it's got some details to it, but then over time, you see these blurred edges? That's the temperature diffusion blurring that temperature field out. And if that's the field that we're using for our fire, maybe we don't want it to be super blurry. Maybe we want to turn that down a little bit just so that we retain some of those details. Okay, so let's turn that back on. So you can see, our original shape now is kind of a bit more broken up, but we're still getting super spherical. That's okay. We're going to add disturbance and stuff to break that up. But that's a bit better. And we can, we can crank this so that we get more and more finer detail. Like that. We could also do the same thing here where we add noise to our points from volume. So instead of using normals though, I'll just add noise to P. And I'll make that three-dimensional noise. And now you can see that that allows me to add noise to that. So that could be another thing that you could do. You can also noise up your values. So here we're just rasterizing everything kind of, they're all the same. Every point has the same value. But we could also take a point VOP here and Get rid of that and that. And use turbulent noise to manipulate values. So let's just bind in temperature for a start, or fuel maybe. Whoops. Fuel, multiply it against that turbulent noise. So that's going to be a one-dimensional noise. Again, let's try alligator. You can output it to color so you can see what that looks like. And put your view flag on the point VOP. There we go, huge. So let's take that frequency down till we see variation. There we go. Roughness. The more roughness you have, the more it will approach white, because it just sort of puts those values everywhere. So you take that down, or to add contrast to that map, you can crush it. So source max and source min, you raise the source min, it's going to get rid of all those grayscale values approaching black. It allows you to crush that noise shape. And then we can maybe increase our scale a little bit. So you get, you know, interesting patterns that way. And then finally, we need to bind export that to fuel again. There we go. So now what we'll see, if we just look at the fuel volume that's being created, now it's all patchy. We could do the same thing for temperature and density if we wanted to, or we don't necessarily need to. You can turn on normalize here as well. You can see by default that's quite blocky. If you normalize by clamped coverage, it's going to get rid of that and make them a bit smaller and more fluffy, which might be better. So we can see that's changing over time. Well, that's done a lot for our detail. I mean, still it's turning into a bit of a blob, but actually that looks a lot more interesting now on the surface. And let's try increasing our point count a little bit. 0.3. 528,000. Go to our volume rasterize, take our particle scale down. There you go. You can see it becomes a little bit more detailed. You can always take our voxel size down a little bit as well, just to get a bit more detail in there. All right, let's try that. Okay, so starting to get there. We're still no shaping settings on the Pyro Solver yet. Let's have a look at our density. So you can see it comes out kind of detailed, but then smooths out pretty quickly over time. That is also probably down to just division size, you know, being quite low resolution. There we go. So we're preserving a few more details there. Still, it is softening over time. That's just kind of what will tend to happen with Pyro. There's quite a bit of jumping around that happens right at the start, which I don't love. So what I'm thinking is that I might, which is, yeah, probably down to this, jumping around quite a bit. So what I might do is take my scale here. I'm going to copy that parameter and put it in a transform mode here. Paste expressions, not relative reference, just the expression, which is the animation. And then I'll get that scale happening in the transform, delete it off the sphere. So start at 5. No, start at 1. Ooh, okay. Let's make that then 1. And that's way too big, and also the pivot is changing. Let's have a look. Where's my keyframes? So I'm going to take that value of 15 down to 5. Let's see. I need to drop my pivot. Or raise it. That's a bit annoying, but redoing that. But what it means is that it's not going to change this noise every frame. So that, you know, then becomes a bit more of a constant shape. And I could choose to change it, but it's up to me now. So I could change it with an offset, potentially. I could animate that over time if I wanted to. I might just need to tweak my frequency a little bit as well. But yeah, now it's kind of down to me, and I can play with these, and it's not going to change every frame. It's a bit more constant, and that will just produce, hopefully, a less poppy looking emission right at the start. Let's just wind that back. Oh, there we go. Well, that's interesting. I've obviously made it a bit bigger than what it was before, but it actually looks quite cool. It's a lot less spherical. I guess taking that noise frequency down probably accounted for a lot of that. But that's, yeah, that's pretty interesting. It's probably too big though if I go and have a look at my base sphere. What's that? There. Once again, I've gone too big. It's, you know, it's always good to be mindful of these things while you're working. I just caught my Houdini console in the corner of my eye, and I thought, oh man, I hope it hasn't crashed. So I might just save this. And let's have a look at our source again. So my scale is getting, yeah, just getting too big. Let me ghost that. Where's my sphere? Can't even see it. There it is. So we want to get to roughly that. Yeah, okay. So that 5 is just too big. Let's go 3. And then we want this to come down as well. To, let's say, 1 again. There we go. Okay, so hopefully that'll be back on track. And you could, you know, you could also play with the amplitude of this noise to turn it up and down. So let's like promote the amplitude so that over time, like maybe right at the start, the amplitude is higher, or perhaps it's lower. Perhaps it's more spherical at the start. And as it scales up to its kind of maximum, it goes a bit more like that, and then perhaps comes down over time as well. I don't know. Yeah, you play with these things. There's our jittering. Oh. Let's go back to the start, reset, play. There we go. So scales come back down again. Now, you know, this may be too much shape. Maybe we do need to be more round, but again, it's just a matter of looking at the reference and not losing sight of kind of what your goal is. It's very easy to, when you're working with Pyro, you can just get carried away with a look or a certain aspect and drift away from what the goal is. Let's just run this and see what it looks like. And again, look at it with lights so that you can kind of appreciate the forms that are going on there. And you can see at the start, it comes out nice and detailed, and then over time, it just blurs. And part of that is the low resolution just softening in. Oh, there's some cool things going on. Alright, let's add some, might take this back up to 0.5 and add some disturbance here. So, usually, the disturbance, especially for an explosion, is quite strong at the start, and then it falls off over time. So what I'm going to do here is disturb the velocity field. I'm going to use a control... Actually, I'll leave a control field off for now, and I'll just have a look at what it looks like. Block size of 0.2 is going to be too small, though, because our scale is much larger than that. Our division size is 0.5, so a block size of 0.2 really isn't going to work too well. So I'm going to do block size of 1 for starters, and see what that kind of does. Okay, so we can see it's working. Well, that's good. It's really small noise that it's putting in there, and it looks like disturbance of 50 is a bit strong. Let's go block size of 5. Okay, so we can see that's working. You can see that larger scale block size starts to look a bit like turbulence. It's really moving that stuff around. But it's good to be able to see kind of what it's doing, just to appreciate, you know, what those values are and how they affect our simulation. So it looks like our disturbance value actually doesn't need to be that strong. At least it doesn't need to be without the control field. So presently, we're just adding disturbance everywhere. If you have a look at the velocity field, which is the field we're disturbing, you can actually see these blocks. Can you see those squares? That's the disturbance. When it talks about block size, that's what it means, is these are the blocks of different directions that the disturbance is creating. So if you take that down, you'll see those shrink. So maybe, let's go for 2. That might be kind of a little bit better. Taking the disturbance value to 1. So at the moment, that disturbance is just going everywhere. It's just being applied everywhere in the field, even all the way out here, which, you know, isn't necessarily a bad thing, but you do want to kind of be able to control it a little bit. So that's not too bad. Let's have a look at that outside. It's pretty strong, so I definitely want to turn it down. But in terms of a large scale disturbance, that maybe not too bad. Let's just turn the value down to 0.1. You can see how that reflects that on the... Here, they're not sort of all red to begin with. Let me just turn that off. So I'm going to layer up disturbances of different scales and different values to create that kind of look, that pyroclastic feeling where you have large scale spheres and then finer details on top of them, and you just have this, you know, sort of I guess you'd call it fractal geometry, sort of fractal breakup of noise. Let's see. All right, maybe that's a little bit too subtle. 0.3. Okay, let's have a look at that. There we go. So it's introducing some interesting shapes. Not getting a lot like right at the top here, but that's okay. Now, one thing, if you use the Sparse tools, you do have this, especially if you use the wrapped up one here, you've got this calculate speed field checkbox, which you can use, which is really handy for using as a control field, because it's like a speed field, which means you can apply disturbance to things when they're moving fast. In here we don't have that. We can create our own, but one that I like to use, which is present already in the solver, is pressure. So you can see here there's a pressure field, and if you visualize the pressure field, let's visualize it in here, the multi-field. Instead of density, I'll visualize pressure. And what you can see is that the pressure field kind of exists. It's like the opposite to what the density field is. It exists outside the density. Let's turn off the disturbance, and then we can see it a bit clearer. So you can see that it's just kind of everywhere, but crucially, what is good about the pressure field is that it exists kind of at the top of your mushroom cloud shapes. So if you have a look at that, let's turn the density down. It's a little bit kind of hard to see. It also does extend into the negatives, but you can kind of see the inverse shapes of those mushroom clouds there. So it exists above them, which is really good for a collision or a control field. Now, a good way to visualize this is to put density there, and let's turn that back to 0 to 1. In the diffuse field of density, you could put pressure and set that to be an infrared ramp. And you can see now, let me play it, you get a strong pressure value right at the start when you get that rapid expansion, but then as it starts to slow down, you get pressure just at these areas that are pushing upwards via buoyancy. A little bit at the base, but you can see how they're just sort of limited to that area. Now, pressure values are really actually quite low, although it looks like we are getting some that are approaching 1 here. But you want to turn on the diffuse range and take that down and just sort of find a good range. You can also see how I'm taking it into the negative here, and that is showing me more of that area. So you think about the values here, -3 is purple. So that's this area. So that's -3. And then as we go through to 0.6 or 1, or even 0.1, we're going through these values. So here, these green values, that'd be around, oh, I don't actually know, whatever is the midpoint between -3 and 0.1. -1.4 or something, I don't know. So yeah, it's a good way to visualize what those pressure values might be and where they exist. So how I would use this is, let me turn that back on, in my disturbance here, instead of applying disturbance everywhere, we use control field, we use pressure, and then here's our control range. So that's what we kind of decided on here, -3 to 0.1. Let's do the same thing, -3 to 0.1. So at -3, 0 disturbance will be applied, and when the pressure value is 0.1, the maximum disturbance will be applied of, 1 times 0.3. So I'll see what happens. What you'll see is that when you add disturbance, though, your pressure value will change because it's changing the way the pressure is calculated, but you should be able to see that, you're getting most of your pressure now applied in this kind of area up here. And now we can crank the value just to see it a little bit more strongly. Right at the start, though, you'll see it's very strong. And then as this sort of starts to calm down, although you can get this kind of reaction going and then it may just not calm down, which is what's happening here. And then it just sort of, the pressure is just sort of self-sustaining and it just kind of, it goes crazy. So maybe 10 was a bit too much. Let's try turning it down. You can animate this value up over time as well, so it doesn't start on and it just sort of comes on gradually. But now this area, this red area, should be getting still disturbed, but then these areas down here will be getting less and less disturbance, and the purple will be getting none. So I find this is a really nice natural way of adding disturbance to those areas. So you can see we're getting a lot of disturbance right at the start, but then as it sort of continues to evolve, just these leading areas at the very top will be getting that disturbance. So they're still forging ahead with that disturbance value. And you can play with that range, so that's why the color is a really good way to visualize it, is, maybe we go 0, -2, or -1 to 1. And then, there's a lot of area which is not getting that disturbance, and then just this area right at the tips which is getting it, or -1 to 0, so that area is getting strong disturbance, and everywhere else is not. Let's try that, -1 to 0. Come back here, put the same value in, -1 to 0. Whoops. Control influence 1. Pressure, block size 2, disturbance 1. Let's see. There we go. So all these areas are now getting 0 disturbance being applied, but still this area up the top here is getting it. And the cool thing is when you add disturbance to your scene, it creates the details, and then if you turn it off, those details are left and they just will continue to evolve. And you can see it's changing all the time as well. So, there will be areas that will turn on, and it's starting to maybe over time get that kind of self-sustaining thing where the pressure is increasing and it's adding more, and that then in turn adds more and more, and maybe it gets eventually too much, but you can always turn that off. You can see it starts to go a little crazy, but it might not look too bad. It's probably too much, you know, we've kind of gone off the deep end with the noise, and the block size is probably a little large, but some really interesting things you can do, you know, with that. So let's maybe turn it down. Maybe the block size will go 1. Let's see what that looks like. Pyro, you know, is a lot about just testing and trying to find those settings that are going to work for you. Obviously, if you do it enough, you kind of start to formulate a bit of an idea of what's going to work and what isn't, but you know, I still find that every time I do an explosion, it takes me quite a bit of testing to get it right. Every scene is different and every way is kind of different, unless you're using a preset that you have or you start with, then it's always going to be slightly different. So that's, you know, that's not looking too bad. Probably looks best from the camera angle. Let's have a look. Getting that nice roll and suction happening. And let's just play it. Actually, what I might do is Flipbook this so we can see it all the way. Yeah. While that's happening, I wanted to mention something cool that's happening this week. CG Spectrum Open Day on the 27th, 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. That's Wednesday my time, but that would be Tuesday, I believe, if you're in that hemisphere. Yes, Tuesday. 28th for me, 27th for Northern Hemisphere people. So yeah, CG Spectrum Open Day. Come and join us. I think we have a ton of people already signed up, and you have a chance to win a Wacom Cintiq 16. And it's just a way to find out more about the school and what we do here, and more about the courses. I'll be talking about the courses, and then there's also a opportunity to ask questions at the end. And, you know, if you're interested in VFX or learning, or there's, you know, a whole bunch of other courses as well that you might be interested in, then come in. You have to register, so make sure you sign up and you'll get a link. And yeah, it should be interesting, should be fun. It's a whole day of stuff planned. So yeah, I thought I'd mention that. I think it would be really cool and be great to see you there if you happen to join. And I wish I could win a Wacom Cintiq. That would be amazing. So, all right, let's have a look. Hey, look at that. That's good. That's what I like to see. Okay, so right at the start, it's just freaking out because it's cooking at the same time I hit play. We've got a good feeling of scale happening. The start's a bit weird, so I'll wait till it's finished before oh, there we go. It looks a little better. This is really cool. That's that negative temperature that's on the ground, creating that suction downwards and spreading out. So that's cool. The start, yeah, I don't know. I think the start could use some work, but you know, this is super low res, and it's got a good feeling to it already. You know, the scale feels alright. Maybe the buoyancy could be a bit greater, so that we get a bit more of the rising. And the faster rising you get, the more of that suction feeling you'll get as well. The disturbance is probably down to the resolution, but the disturbance does seem to be creating a bit of artifacting, which I can see this kind of grid pattern in here. So I want to get rid of that. That's not good. Don't want to see any of that sort of stuff. Dissipation is probably a little fast. So you can see about here it starts to turn and starts to look a bit weird the way it falls or the way it fades out. So the dissipation is too fast. But I am really liking a lot of the things that are going on here. I'm going to do another sim and see what upping the buoyancy value looks like. Or temperature. I could just crank the temperature value as well. That will have the same result. But upping the temperature value will also affect the look. So you have to kind of choose which one you want to go for there. Let's see, it's almost done. 4 frames to go. I'm losing a bit of my central column here, and maybe that's because of dissipation. So I want to kind of investigate that. But yeah, that's looking pretty cool. All right, so first things first, dissipation. It's at 0.05, but I'm going to turn it down. I usually don't like to have dissipation. I can control it in the shader if I need to, or, just have a little bit and you play around with it. I'm going to also, let's see, buoyancy lift or temperature. Which one should I do? Maybe I'll do buoyancy lift. So that overall, it's got greater rising effect. And my time scale here, I'm ramping down between 10 and 24. Let's have a look at that in the simulation. So we've got 10 to 24. Maybe I should make that a little later so that we've got... We need to play with our expansion at the start, but let's go... I reckon maybe 20 to 48. Oh, I don't know. 15 to 30? Not sure. Let's click on this. I'm just going to drag these out more like that. There we go. Something like that. Cooling rate. Yeah, it should be alright. So we've got our single disturbance, our combustion, gas released. We could add more expansion just to try and get more of that ball type shape. See that? Because the expansion will expand and create more of that rounder shape. There we go. Speed, you can see the speed and also the buoyancy is making it rise more. And then now it should be slowing down in this area. So already we've got a much sort of more risen shape by frame 30 if we compare where we were at previously. You can see it's much higher, much taller already. Maybe the speed is a little bit too quick in that area. So perhaps I want to do that over a longer duration. Maybe something like this. So that it starts falling off sooner. Maybe it's a little bit more of a gradual speed change. Everyone's so quiet today. Hope I haven't bored you with my explosion. No, it's not. It doesn't look the prettiest yet, but give it time. Give it a chance. Let it grow. Alright, let's see what that looks like. It's a bit more gradual, that speed roll off. Maybe. I don't know. And what else? Cooling rate is an interesting one you can play with as well. So cooling rate is going to cool the temperature down every step, every frame or every sub-step, whatever you have. So it's going to reduce the temperature by 0.75, so 75%, which is quite a lot. If you put it at 1, it's going to reduce the temperature 100%, and it will just kind of not rise. It might rise a little bit, but the temperature is then just going to cool straight away and then just kind of die. You can see it's not rising anymore. So all the temperature has been removed. If you set it really low, then it's going to persist for a lot longer, and you'll get a lot more of an effect of rising for a lot longer because that temperature has been maintained. it's only removing 10% of your frame rather than 75%. So it will also persist in the sim, so you get that temperature kind of coming through. If you have a look at the emission, for example, oh, that looks cool, apart from the purple. But what you will see is that that temperature doesn't really get removed. It sort of persists for a really long time. So if we maybe get rid of pressure, or at least turn the ramp off, maybe get rid of that. Set that to grayscale, perhaps. There we go. So you can see this area of negative temperature or zero temperature down here, how it affects the look. So that's what you do need to be careful of. That's coming from the plane, so it does affect the shader. But we could probably do something about that, refit the values or something. So yeah, you can see it persists for a lot longer. So if we have a look now, we've got this temperature value, and it's just sort of hanging around in the simulation for a really long time. Whereas if you have that higher, back at what we had, 0.75, then you will start to see that be removed and disappear a lot faster. You can see already. It's completely different. It changes the look of the sim too, so it's worth kind of experimenting with that when you have an explosion. Quite often, you do want it to be a bit more persistent with such a large-scale explosion that's, burning with the power of 1,000 suns or whatever they say. You do want that heat to retain and burn up into the atmosphere. If you have a look again at those references, we've got, persistent heat really all the way up. So perhaps, you want to think about how much of that heat you want to retain. And as you can see, it changes the way that the simulation works as well, because it has that, that kind of feeling of rising for a lot greater of the time. And I guess you could create that taller feeling, like we're seeing in that. A lot of these references, you got this very tall area here. That's looks like a bad compositing job. But this very tall section here. So, maybe that's a way to create that feeling. And we're not quite getting it. We're not quite getting that very narrow column yet. Yeah, that negative temperature is really interesting. What it does, I'm not sure it's quite perfect. It's not quite right. It's certainly an interesting effect, but perhaps what if we set it to 0? See what that kind of looks like. Well, that's interesting. Still getting black down there. I guess that's down to that. Maybe I'll just get rid of that. Make it a single value. You can see now we don't get that stuff happening on the ground, which I kind of liked. Yeah, I don't know. We'll just do -1. Get some of it, but not all of it. You get a little bit of that stickiness happening. The other thing you can do with temperature... Hey, Keegan. Yeah, absolutely. You could combine pyrosims, and that's probably what I would do, especially, you know, if I was going for something like that one that I like, this one, absolutely this stuff I would do as a separate pyrosim. You know, you get the main event, and then you layer up with all these additional ones that, you know, all these kind of shockwave elements. I would certainly do that as a separate simulation. So we'll probably look at that next week. You know, all this sort of supporting stuff. The main cloud is, you know, the main sort of focus of this simulation. And then everything that we're not getting, we won't try and do it in the same simulation, or possibly do it in the same simulation but be a different source so that you get interaction. Although you can get interaction, you know, in separate sims as well. But yeah, I think we'll probably look at that next week. But yeah, absolutely, you can do separate ones. Yeah, it's getting there. It's getting there for sure. It's one thing that might be helpful if you, again, you know, reference. It's really good to look at. You can see we don't have a straight thing here. We've got this kind of, you know, leaning over, and that's probably caused by wind. It might just be caused by the source changing over time, but let's get some wind on there. Oh, this is a great one. Look at that. Amazing. These lines are really cool. I can't remember what they're called, but yeah, they do have a particular name, I thought. So let's get a bit of wind in there. We could add wind, you know, in lots of different ways, but you could just use a gas wind plugged into velocity update timescale. You kind of want to match the timescale of your solver. So copy parameter, paste relative reference into timescale, and then choose the wind direction. So I'm going to do, based on my camera, it's X is that way. So I'm going to, oh yeah, there we go, positive 1 in X. That's what we want. The wind scale is probably going to be too strong, so I'll turn that down. And then we should see a bit of a directional movement. Now we've got 10 minutes left, so let me show you something cool with wind. I mean, that, you know, the gas wind serves as a pretty okay kind of wind, you know, if you just want wind all the time in one direction. But quite often with these sort of sims, we want to recreate an effect like this where, you know, it's mostly straight, but then right at the top it's starting to blow over, which in reality you would imagine there's like different wind at different altitudes. So maybe this is some sort of strong wind that's higher up, and you really want to sculpt your simulation in a certain way. So perhaps we'll create, instead of doing the gas wind, we'll create our own one, and we can use a gas field VOP or VEX to do this. I'm just going to do a VOP, so it's a bit easier to kind of demonstrate. Now, any force or any movement in Pyro is velocity. So what we're going to do is bind vel. It's a vector field. So this is now, it's VOPs, but we're working with volumes. So this is the velocity field. And we're also going to bind export the velocity field. So 3 floats vector vel. And if I just put a constant node down here, set it to vector, and add that to velocity, what you will see, if I put 1 in X, is that it should just shoot. Let me make sure that it's plugged in. Yes, it's plugged in. It's plugged into velocity update, gas field VOP, vel, add vel. So it should, in theory, just push this stuff over. There you go. You can see it happening. It's quite strong. So I've just created my own wind now, and that's great because it allows me to now control that. I could animate it, I could do whatever. I could even add noise to it if I really wanted to. This really is the start of how you can create your own shaping settings as well. So here's now quite a strong wind, but if I added a multiplier to that, I could control it. this really should just be the direction, and then you could add a multiplier for the amplitude of that wind. But what I'm going to do here is I've got my max bounds here, my original boundary, which sort of dictates the height that this simulation is going to be, the max height that this could be. In a gas field VOP, under inputs, you can bring in other objects. So I could bring in the max bounds. Then inside here, get attribute from the second input. So there's no inputs to this gas field VOP, but they're referring to these, input 2. You don't want to use input 1. It just doesn't work too well because this is technically input 1, everything that's happening in here. So input 2, the attribute is P. And I'm going to... Oh, actually... Yeah, I think this will work. Let's see. We don't have... we don't actually have a point number here. I'm wondering how that's going to work. Let's try get... I'm not sure if this is going to work. Let's see. P, because I don't have a bounding box to hook up to here. Get B box. Oops, B box. Bounding box, point, bounding box. Ah, actually, maybe I don't need to. I'll just hook that up to... Oh, wait. Relative bounding box. This one. File, second input. Group, I don't have a group. P, let's hook that up to P. Okay, let's see if this works. So relative bounding box. File is the second input. P into P, and then I don't have a group here. Maybe I could choose a group. I don't know if I need to. Now this is spitting out a vector, which is the size of that object. If you have a look at here, if I middle click, you can see this is giving me a size, 100 by 100 by 100. With a relative bounding box, it gives you that in 0 to 1 from lowest to highest point, or sideways or depth. I just want Y, so I'm going to do vector to float. To split these into 3 components, and Y here. So let's multiply this value, this one direction value, by this Y channel. And see what happens. Now, I can visualize this by turning on velocity. So I turn my velocity on. And let's see. It's actually hard to tell when you have disturbance on as well, because it disturbs the field. Are you making a nuclear bomb explosion? If so, the scaling might make it more realistic. What, sorry, sphere squared, which scaling are you referring to? So, what I want to see here is my wind field kind of being stronger at the top, which I'm hoping will happen, because what should be occurring with that bounding box value, it's not really showing me in the velocity, but what should be occurring is that it should be 0 here and 1 at the very top of that box. So what should happen is that the wind should be stronger as it goes higher, which it does look like it's doing. So you can see we're getting that diagonal sort of shift. But what I'm going to do here to give this even more control is run that through a ramp parameter, spline ramp. And then I can actually control specifically where that is going to be. So if I turn that like that, that's kind of what we had, 0 to 1, like that. But if I did this, for example, then the wind is not going to start until halfway up the bounding box. So let's have a look at that. So there we go, it looks pretty straight. And then, and a really good way to test this is just to crank this value. Maybe even put a promote here and just call this wind strength. Like that. Let's make that 10. In fact, let's make it 100. Why not? So we should see nothing being applied here, which is good. You know, you would expect if that was being applied, 100 would just be really whipping that off. But then as it crosses the halfway threshold, we should see that it should get moved. Here we go. I think it's starting to happen. Hey, look at that. There you go. So now I've got a height control for the wind, and I can bring it on at a specific point. Now, obviously that's, you know, a little bit crazy, although, you know, maybe it's a type of effect that you want, and sometimes it might be. But, you know, now we've got this really specific height control, so we can, you know, drop that deck down to 1 and say that, you know, maybe like something like that. So the wind is not super strong, but then as it approaches the top, it gets much stronger. So you get that gradual kind of shift in direction. Let's see what this looks like. Yeah, sorry, Sphere Squared. I don't really understand. Maybe, do you mean the scaling of the source? I don't know. So we should see now a bit of a gradual kind of directional change, and then it will increase the higher it gets. It will rise, or sorry, drift more to the right. So yeah, you know, there you go. You can see it's kind of happening there. It's not, you know, it's not super strong, but that's all I want. It's a very subtle thing, and I could, you know, change this so it's kicking in, you know, maybe halfway, so that portion becomes, you know, remains straight. So let's turn the disturbance back on and turn our velocity off, turn our camera back, see what we get here. And increasing the voxel size is going to make a dramatic difference to this. I mean, this is very slow, very low res, just so that I can quickly play blast it and quickly iterate on it. I mean, that's the key thing for me, is being able to iterate on it quickly. Probably need to move my camera back a little bit. But then, you know, the final test would be just to do a higher res simulation, just to see what other details we're getting and what we still need to do in terms of adding fine details with more disturbance layers. But overall, you know, the motion, the shape probably could be a little less, sort of less shapely. You know, it could be a bit rounder. I think maybe might look a little more realistic in terms of the expansion of a nuclear explosion. But, you know, that's not too hard to change. We had that at the start and we added all that noise in, so we could turn some of that down potentially. Finally, you do have, you know, the look of it. So, you know, we can change the way that this is going to look by having a look at the temperature values and just giving it, you know, a nice kind of shader and a nice kind of rendering appearance. There we go. Nice bit of heat. And you can see that that helps bring out some of the details, and especially looking at it with a light really helps to kind of visualize that stuff. Again, temperature in there can sort of help as well. So what res have we got? We're only at 2 million voxels really, so very low resolution. So you would hope that we'll see a ton more details at a higher res. You also have the pyro bake volume node, which is really cool for explosions. So turn on the scatter and it will create this kind of really nice look. Again, doesn't look that good on low resolution, but it creates this kind of feeling of internal scattering, which is quite cool. So that can be something that we can play with once we start looking at the look of it. But I'm out of time today, so we'll have to leave it there. Hopefully, you know, that's a good start, and then next week we can keep going with it, adding more details and adding extra extra kind of elements. And, you know, I'll continue to work on this expansion as well. It's not quite there yet in terms of the reference, and, you know, perhaps it just needs to be quicker as well. Maybe it needs to jump more from, you know, from that point to that point over a shorter amount of frames. And I think probably, you know, that noise could be turned off or reduced. So, you know, thinking about jumping to that scale a bit faster, or maybe even going a little bit larger. Yeah, perhaps we just jump to it, you know, like that. I don't know. Need to play with it. But, yeah. There we go. Hey, there we go. Big ball. So, thank you for joining me. Don't forget about the open day. I think that'll be a really cool event. If you're interested in the school or curious about what we do here, then please register and join us on the 27th, 28th if you're in Australia. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you guys there, and we'll keep going with this next week, and, you know, for however long it takes to make it look amazing. And if you have any questions or any, you know, kind of comments or suggestions for effects to work on, then I'm always writing down ideas to you know, consider them for future projects. So please, you know, keep them coming. It's really handy to have those. Cool. All right. Well, thanks, guys. Thanks for joining me. Have a good day. Have a good week. And I'll see you guys next week. Thanks, Keegan. Thank you, everybody.